so where we are today is we are definitely deep in the throes of that that bifurcation, that split within the global financial system.
Well, hello there, my friends. Chris Marcus here with you for Arcadia Economics, and quite excited today as we have one of our most popular guests who comes on the show from time to time, and certainly one of my teachers these days, as he has quite an incredible understanding of not just the economics and the finances, but also a lot of the geopolitical things that are going on in the world that obviously, as unfortunately we're well aware, have been escalating over these past couple of years, and perhaps not unconnected entirely to what we're seeing happening in the metals. And fortunately, to dig through all of that today, I am joined by Tom Luongo of Gold, Goats, and Guns. And Tom, I guess it's a boring season in the geopolitical and financial world. Nothing happening, so we'll just say hello and wrap this one up. But
Hey man, yeah. So how's your guitar playing going? Like, what's going on? There ain't nothing going on in this freaking world, right? This is here we are on Martin Armstrong's big May 7th day, the turn of the quote unquote economic competence model and all that, and it's not disappointing. Like I've already like fielded questions from the patrons over on our private Slack server, and like, oh yeah, there's Marty. I'm like, really? You can't see what's happening? Like, the Russians threatening to nuke the friggin' Brits. Like, that's not, I've always found it interesting. Like Martin's work, just to clarify it for people. Like, I find Martin's work interesting. I find Socrates to be an interesting tool. I don't necessarily take a lot of stock in it. I like to salt it to my own personal taste. And and Marty's, himself has said, look, I never got into this to be a geopolitical analyst, but I did it to augment my trading and whatnot. And I'm like, and it's fair. Like I've noted over the years that Martin might zero in on a date and think it's that particular event's going to be the big thing, and it's not. It turns out to be something completely different. But the dates are interesting. They wind up being turning points, whether they're self-fulfilling prophecies or not, because we now have a quote unquote model of how human behavior works, which I roll my eyes at a little bit. It is, I think, tapped into something real, whether it's wholly correct or not. Like I don't think Martin Armstrong is Hari Seldon from the Foundation novels, but I do think that he's tapped into something interesting in the same way that astrology taps into something interesting, or eschatology, of various religions taps into something very interesting. I think if you use all of those things as springboards for idea generation, then they become very valuable. But it's always about filtering things through your own experience and your own your own intuition. And that's all I really do, is I just filter all this stuff through that, along with bouncing ideas off of the patrons and the world and blah 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 blah, and then we see what we come up with. And sometimes you come up with a really accurate quote unquote model of the world, and you gotta, I don't know. So where we are today is yeah, like, that happened. The Russians, told the UK that if your missiles are used to attack, strategic uh, positions or any positions inside the borders of Russia, we're going to consider you an enemy combatant. We're at war with you. That's not a thing. Like, really? Like, that's nothing. That's just nothing. It's just a little nothing. It's just a little nothing burger. It's a huge thing, and it's, I think, indicative of just where Putin has been pushed by these people, to the point of, because they need this war, they need this kind of milieu in which to do what they want to do, which is to default on all the debt and burn down the old financial system, which is broke, which is why you do what you do and I do what I do, right? We're all waiting for the thing to go broke, and then figure out how they can do so and justify it and still stay in power. That's the plan. Now the question is whether they're going to be able to pull that plan off. And of course, Putin's job is to act like, the modern incarnation of Adolf Hitler, that they can blame all their ills on, or the Kaiser, or anybody else. Like, just keep going back through history with these people. They keep doing it over and over and over again. So it's the same people over and over. As well as I do, that where I think most of these ideas gestated from, where they come from, and and I don't think it's a euphemism for another group of people. I think they're all using each other. I think old Dutch money, old Jewish money, old Italian money, old British money, old US money, blah, blah. I think they're all using each other at this point. And I also think that they're fighting amongst themselves as who's going to be in charge on who thinks they're going to wind up being in charge on the other side. And, look, at the end of the day, it's not a dinner club at the top of the world. It's Thunderdome. And they used to be the ones in charge of Thunderdome. And they don't realize that we erected another one around them, and they're having to fight amongst themselves now. And which one of the factions are going to be? It's like Shark Tank. Actually, probably a better, you know, as long as there are plenty of other fish for the sharks to eat, they don't need to eat each other. They've run out of money, right? They're all broke. Their central banks, their balance sheets are all leveraged to the tits, right? Blah blah blah. Like there's no money left. System's broke. Now they start turning on each other, and that's what's going on. And that's the hardest part for people to grasp, because we've gotten so inculcated and we've gotten so used to the framework that it's all one big club and we ain't in it, to quote George Carlin, that it's really hard to shift that mindset. Look, dude, it took me years. I'm not sitting here because oh, I'm so insouciant and wise and blah, blah. I saw this come. No, well, not nonsense. I might have saw it before everybody else, but doesn't mean that I wasn't blindsided when it hit me like a ton of bricks. And honestly, back in 2021, and there were other people out there screaming about this stuff well before I ever did. So, I'm not anything special here. I'm just, depending on your frame of view, or your point of view, I could be late to the party. Yeah. Right. So.
Well, I hear what you're saying, and I guess that would be a great place to start in terms of whether we're late or early. Where you think we stand right now? You had a great column that you put out recently, and it was about the end of foreign exchange reserves, digging into the sanctions, Congress facilitating so that the president could go ahead and seize some of the frozen assets. Time since then, we've seen Russia, who said they vowed a mirror response, went and froze 440 million of JP Morgan assets. And then a week later, we see the US sanction China and Russia. Certainly seems like it's escalating, getting to a bit of a scary point for the regular
person. It really is.
Just trying to do their thing and get by. So curious, you mentioned that we're getting to the point where they're out of money. And obviously, it seemed like that for a long time, although perhaps you could start there and maybe put some specifics on where we are in this cycle.
I think I think a lot of us in the Austro-libertarian / gold bug hard precious metals community missed and coming out of 2008 was that there was plenty of room on the central bank balance sheets to take on another round of levering up, right? And so we all were. I don't know about you, but I know I was sitting there in 2008 going, "This is it." I was like right there next to Jim Sinclair going, "This is it. It's all done. We're gonna. This is the big kahuna." And then Bernanke came in and levered up the balance sheet, and so did the ECB, and so did the BOJ even further, and the SNB and the bank. All of them. They all did it, right? The Bank of France, the Bundesbank, blah 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 blah. And then they ran out. And they coordinated central bank policy for a long, long time. Oh, the Bank of England. Let's never forget the Bank of England. And then they ran out of balance sheet room. Predictable as the day is long. That once they ran out of room on the balance sheets and interest rates then started to rise because now inflation is coming. And then they tried to break the world with COVID in order to try and implement their new bait and switch to a digital currency and all the rest of it. And the problem is that over the course of that time, the Russians and the Chinese, and to a lesser extent the Iranians, and whatnot, they all started to see see what the game was, and they were making very, very strategic moves to counter this by divesting themselves and separating themselves from the existing system, such that when the system failed, they wouldn't be caught in the vortex. Now, China's not out of this vortex in no way, manner, shape, or form. They're still too intricately linked with the United States economy. But the Russians, no. The Iranians were cut out of the global financial system by Obama in 2011. They were forced, 2011, 2012, they were forced into this move. No one expected Iran to survive. They survived. When they did it, they provided the blueprint for how the Russians did it in 2015. Getting China on their side to give them a hand. And now we're here in 2024, and China's doing the exact same thing now that they did for Russia back in 2015, which is they're taking their dollar reserves, handing that off to their Asian trade partners like Indonesia or Vietnam or Thailand or whomever that have a lot of dollar denominated liabilities, and they're saying, look, we'll loan you the money in dollars, but you pay us back in yuan. This is exactly what the Russians did, and the Russians were able to do this because they have a huge energy, because they built this huge trade network, or trade turnover over Russian energy. So the three things when you go back over that and you think, okay, so what did the Russians do to stave off the ruble crisis of 2014, 2015? They they liberalized the economy, right? They removed certain old Soviet restrictions that were still latent in the economy. They changed the way the ruble was being distributed. Their trade surplus was being distributed amongst the Russian society. They shifted from subsidizing oil and gas to subsidizing food production and domestic industrial production. That was the first thing. The second thing they did was they opened up ruble yuan swap lines with the Chinese, and the third thing they did was raise interest rates to AIDA and divest and then pay off the old dollar and euro denominated debt, and signed the big Power of Siberia package with the Chinese, which I think they did before all this happened. They did that early in 2014, so they were already laying the groundwork for it, because they already knew that the United States and the West were going to cut Russia out. We're going to make an attack on the price of oil. Right. That's why the big pipeline deal, that $400 billion mega deal that we all remember from that year, that all happened in preparation for what was coming next. So now the Chinese would have a flow of, the Russians would have a flow of yuan coming into the country to pay for their oil, and they use those to pay back their dollar denominated loans back to China, and that's how they paid off all the corporate debt and everything else. Well, same thing's happening across Asia right now. Same thing is happening, and this is what the de-dollarization stuff is all really about. I think the Fed is hip to this. I think that's why the Powell has done what he's done, and he's made abundantly clear that we have to keep this going. We have to keep on this path for as long as possible, because for the dollar to survive and for the Fed to survive, the Fed has to get control of its own monetary policy, meaning it has to break the back of the Eurodollar system that was put in place mostly through City of London, starting in 1956, which Jeff Snyder, for years accurately described. Where Jeff is wrong now is that the game has changed. And, I'm on record as saying this multiple times, that Jeff hasn't updated his model of how the universe works. This was not a free market system. This was a system designed from the ground up for City of London to still have complete colonial control over the U.S. financial system. Our feckless, bankers and on Wall Street went along with it because they were making money off of it. Why wouldn't they? And that's all they care about is making money. These people are immoral. They're not, they're not moral actors here. They're not nationalists. Maybe of all of them, I think the only one who is anything close to being an American sovereign, this is Jamie Dimon over at JP Morgan. I think it's very clear that Dimon is, but at the same time, I don't think that Dimon is any kind of, I don't think he's any kind of, moral standard bearer or anything. Let's not kid ourselves. Like, let's not overstate the truth. Let's not overstate the obvious. All right. Overstate the argument, as it were. So I don't know. So where we are today is we are definitely deep in the throes of that bifurcation, that split within the global financial system. And and money's going to ground over the sanctions and over the seizing of the foreign exchange reserves and everything else. That's where all these threats are coming from. The split is happening now. Okay. And but the groundwork for this split has been being laid for like 15 years. Yeah. Okay. So now everybody's buying gold hand over fist. Now the central banks are 20% of the global demand. Like, do you need to know anything else? Every time gold sells off $50 or $75, the central banks are coming in and buying it with both fists. The United States is putting soft capital controls on physical gold leaving the country. All right. Chris, they're going to get rid of the COMEX. It's already happening. COMEX is being drained. Same way the way another /FOFOA talked about fucking 25 years ago. All right. So which I know for people who are long suffering gold bugs, gold and silver bugs, you know exactly the reference I'm making here. You know, the newbies don't have this is Swahili to you guys. But by the way, that's your clue. Go back and realize that this has much deeper roots, and that what's happening now was foreseen then. What they missed, what the guy at that point missed then was the euro, the size and scope of the Eurodollar system that was built after the balance sheets of the central banks were then mobilized to keep the system alive for another 15 years. End game was always going to be the same. They just staved it off for 15 years. But now, because of this, everybody is retreating back within their borders. And now gold, and to a lesser extent silver, are the important assets here. So, and they're only important because they're ultimately, in the end, going to be the things that collateralize or that are going to be used as a unit of account to pay for oil and energy in the future.
Yeah.
That's just that simple. It ain't really that freaking hard, folks. It's that elemental.
Well, I'll follow that up with perhaps an unfair or unanswerable question, yet everybody sits around, not everybody, but a lot of people in the gold and silver community sit around saying, all right, this seems illogical. We've seen it building for years. We had a bit of a scare last year when a couple banks went down. Then we have BTFP. Do you think we're reaching that point where it can't be pushed off and prolonged anymore, and that we're getting closer to a break point? Or could we be here 2 years from now in a similar environment? Gold's $2,600, silver's 35, and prices of things have gone up, yet perhaps some sort of break point hasn't occurred yet. Any thoughts on that?
You know, is that a non-zero probability what you just laid out? Of course. Of course. Is it a high probability? No. I think we're much closer to that moment than we have ever been. I think the SNB lowering interest rates in April was a big tell because the stories were finally starting to get out there. My dog agrees with me. If you hear her off in the background, that's, you know, she always agrees with me. She's a good girl. But I think the stories were getting out there that the German banking system was in serious trouble because the American commercial real estate markets are now finally starting to break. We're finally starting to see some movement in commercial real estate liquidations, right? As we've expected for the last couple of years. As Powell raised rates this quickly, everybody's got holes in their balance sheets that need to be papered over. Meanwhile, the pension systems and the insurance companies are all licking their lips and like lions, just seeing a whole bunch of wounded zebra out there. Like, oh my God, this is going to be a smorgasbord where they can go up and they can pick up these buildings that are immense and young and new and, you know, unoccupied and pick them up for 20 cents on the freaking dollar. And then rent them out with 50% occupancy and make more money than the original business plan would have called for in the first place. And they've got massive money sitting on their balance sheets to do this. I was talking with my life insurance guy over at Northwestern Mutual the other day, and this is exactly the thing I laid out to them. I'm like, you have, and he's like, oh, and by the way, the board agrees with you. Like, they can't wait to go out and make these deals because they know they're going to outperform. Like, I'm not, I'm not pimping Northwestern Mutual or anything, but I'm just saying, like, I had this very conversation with my insurance agent, not like last Thursday. And I said, hey, oh, by the way, my speaking fee is very reasonable if you want me to speak to the board to, give them a strategy on this. Drum up business where you can, right? So, seriously, I did that. I part of me is like, did you just do that? Yeah, you just did that. But it's, we're staring at that going back to the Bundesbank. We know that German real estate is heavily invested in American commercial real estate because they were at the negative bound for so long that in order for them to pay out their 8% pension guarantees and everything else, they had to go into the leverage loan market. Right. And now we also know that the SNB is basically a wholly owned subsidiary of the Bundesbank. And so was it any shock that when there was the beginnings of a rumbling that the Bundesbank was in trouble, that the German Landesbanks were in trouble, that the SNB came in and rapidly devalued the Swiss franc versus the dollar rapidly. came in, it was trading at 92 cents. Now it's trading at under 84 in like 6 weeks. It's a huge move in the Swiss franc, but it makes perfect sense if you understand who works for whom and who's subordinate to whom. So clearly, the SNB is not an open actor. So that's just one of those big tells that Europe is cracking hard, which is why they're so desperate to gin up a bigger and wider war, because there's a moment here where they need to be able to default, get the United States to yell at China and then default on their debt and get the United States to go first. Everything that's happening right now is between Europe and the United States is a game of you go first. No, you go first. No, you go first. You seize Russia's foreign exchange assets. No, you do it first. If you do it, I'll do it. Right? So when you read the text of the bill that was signed by that was put in front of Biden, it was Biden is authorized to seize Russia's foreign exchange reserves if it is part of a coordinated action by the rest of the G7.
No.
That's another way of saying, no, you go first. Right? Feeling froggy, take that leap, to quote Dennis Miller. So, and then the same thing is happening with, the French, like toe dipping in, just putting in the tip. That's just the tip. We're just putting the French Foreign Legion in Odessa. It's just the tip. Or, but then the minute they get to the moment where they're going to like throw a whole bunch of German troops in there, that ain't happening. Like they keep trying to get someone to do the thing. And it's sad and it's pathetic. And as always, guess who's out there stirring the pot to the point of trying to get us past the point of no return? Same damn people who started World War I, same damn people who started World War II, same damn people who have been pulling the strings of our financial system for years, same damn people that I've been screaming about nonstop for the last 3 years. And I take more flack for being over the target about City of London and the friggin' British than I have ever taken any flack on any single issue in my entire life. And I got news for you. That's the tell. And now everybody wants to turn around to become a newly minted expert on Zionism, because most people couldn't even spell the word the other day, last week, or they couldn't find Ukraine on a map with like most of these people can't find their ass with a map in both hands, as my dad would say, and they couldn't find Ukraine on a map to save their lives. But all of a sudden they were experts on Ukraine. Just like we had newly minted virologists during COVID, just like we had, like it's all bullshit, folks. It's all nonsense. And I'm not, this is not to absolve anybody of their complicity in this. And I'm not running a cover story for, like, I've already been accused of being a Zionist, like 18 Ways from Sunday. And I'm like, this is the dumbest thing imaginable. It's just the dumbest thing imaginable. But, whatever. Like, if that's what you want to believe, you go right ahead and, live in the matrix. That's fine with me. I don't care. Your model of the universe is wrong. And models aren't, maps are no more the world than Martin Armstrong's model of the financial system is a map of human behavior, is, how we actually behave. It's the same way that technical analysis is not markets, which is why I don't draw, for example, it's why I don't draw lines on charts, right? I mean, I only found out this morning, folks, that Chris is a patron. So I'm like, oh my God. So you actually, like, he knows what I'm talking about. Like, I don't draw lines on charts. I don't do any of this other rotten nonsense. I don't do any statistical interpretive dances around the data of the markets. Why? Because it's all a model that's based on, a kind of soft back test, but really it's just a reification of reality. It's not reality. It's a representation of reality that your mind has overlaid a pattern on, not necessarily saying that pattern is wrong, but it's not necessarily predictive. And that's what's really important. It's a very subtle point about all of this. It doesn't matter if we're talking about geopolitics or we're talking about markets, or we're talking about, the box office receipts for a movie or anything. It's all the same thing. And the model is not the world. I absolutely, everybody who's like telling me that I'm, who's listening to this and going, Tom's full of shit and blah, 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 sit down and listen to Ian McGilchrist talk for about an hour about this. But the left brain, right brain, the model, and ask yourself whether you see yourself as a machine or an animal. I'm an animal.
Yeah.
I'm not a machine. Okay. And if you do that, you'll start to snap yourself out of this kind of false binary thinking. And which is what we need to do, because they're clearly driving us mad with all of it. All right. So
Well,
I
one
don't know if
part,
that was the answer you wanted, Chris, but it's the answer you got.
no, it makes a lot of sense. And I would say one part of the model that you got quite right. I know you took a lot of heat on it for
Mhm.
the 2 years while we were watching you be correct. I don't know many other people who were saying the Fed was not going to pivot as quickly as most were expecting. Obviously, even going back to the beginning of this year, quite, I mean, what around May 7th today? So that was only 4 months and a week ago
Right.
when it
Right.
was 6, 7 rate cuts priced in. Certainly, you've been correct about that. Would love to know what you see them doing in this situation. I've been surprised to see the stock market soaring to all-time highs, even in the face of the higher interest rates, and that we haven't seen more chaos yet. Again, you had the BTFP, which probably helped things last year. But what do you see them doing now? And then maybe if you want to work in along with this, if there's anything that you would advise differently than what you see them actually ultimately doing.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll see if I can try and stay on point. Yes, I know, anybody who was following the biweekly market reports that I do for patrons, that I said flat out firmly multiple times, these markets are mispriced. This is a fantasy it's almost like it was a blackmail attempt. It was a massive there was a massive psyop pushed into the markets during Q4 of last year to break the momentum to the downside on bond prices in the United States and therefore stop interest rates from rising. And then we had everything else was an attendant thing on that. And they spent billions, hundreds of billions of dollars in foreign exchange reserves to get this done. You can see it's the fingerprints of it are all over the Treasury International Capital Report. But I said flat out, there's no friggin' way the Fed is going to cut interest rates 7 times, which is what we priced in to perfection, by the way, uh, at year end. It was insane. And I'm like, that's not going to happen. At best, the Fed's going to cut three times at best. And I can see that being maybe starting in June. I don't know when it's going to start, but let's say June. Let's pick a date. That's all I did. I just picked the date out of the back of my head. Now I'm like, they ain't going to cut until now. They may still cut in June. I don't think they will. I think they're more likely if they have to cut because things are deteriorating too quickly. The Fed's not going to cut until something breaks. And just to be clear here, because you've invoked this a couple of times now, I don't believe that the market broke last March. I believe the Fed executed a whole bunch of onshore Eurodollar banks that were being used to undermine Fed policy. And that this was actually a war between the San Francisco Fed and the New York Fed. And the New York Fed won every frickin' battle. Okay, it's a very subtle point. I talked about it in the newsletter at our newsletter to great extent. I talked about it in multiple interviews. I still feel I am absolutely correct about this. So I don't think that the BTFP was anything more than a means by which to slowly begin removing the stigma of American banks having to go to the discount window if they get into trouble. The goal here is to get the American banks to use the tools that are at their disposal and not be so scared because the Powell is like psychologically prepping them for the day when they are going to have to go to the discount window. Now he's mandating it. Everybody has to go to the discount window once a year, right? That's like it's as clear as day. This is what his policy is because he wants them to utilize the tools that are at their disposal in order to save the American banking system during what is going to be an epic credit contraction. That credit contraction is already happening. So we're going to have banks fail. We're going to have things happen. We're all going to get our hair mussed, to quote, George C. Scott from Dr. Strangelove. This is happening. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be fun. It's going to be ugly. We're not going to like it. We're all going to piss, whine, bitch, and moan about it. And that's just the way it is. That's what recessions do, right? That's what stagflation brings. But don't think that this is not part of the plan, and don't listen to anybody gaslighting you into thinking that this is the Fed now going to evilly, turn the tables on everybody, and then there's going to be this big, massive, great taking and all of that. So that's nonsense. It's going to happen in Europe, folks. They're like setting it up to take all your private property away from you. They're not doing it here. I don't see mortgage rates at 7% as apocalyptic. I just don't like Dude, we're just going back to like 1994. Like my first mortgage was 8%. Like, get over yourself. It's not the apocalypse. Mortgage rates at 30%. Talk to the Turks. That's apocalyptic. 8%. No, that's kind of what a 30-year rate kind of should be, don't you think? Like, and everybody is so gaslit and so used to the idea that long-term interest rates should be 2-3%. They've lost their minds. That's not the way risk capital works. That's your model based on your experience talking. That's not the model of, that's not what reality is. Reality is that a 30-year mortgage always carried an 8% risk premium or 9% risk premium. That's the truth. And anything else was subsidized through government spending. That's the truth. So now let's remove some of that. Now there's no balance sheet room for the government to, lever that up and to take that on and take that idea, to take those bad debts, honestly, onto the balance sheet of the nation. Can't do it anymore. So what I think is going to come next. Well, I hate to disappoint people, but Janet Yellen is going to continue to do yield curve control out of the Treasury, trying to undermine what Powell's doing. They're trying to run out the clock. They're trying to save the ECB and the European Central Bank, and they're trying to limp along until the European parliamentary elections in June. And then, they're just trying to limp from thing to thing to thing and hope that they can get an escalation of conflagrations in either the Middle East and or Ukraine in order to then try and force Powell to monetize a whole bunch of debt that they want to issue to fight a war that no one wants. Okay, that's the goal. So what's Powell going to do? I don't know. Is Powell strong enough to stand up to these guys? I think Mike Johnson stood up to them over Ukraine funding for 4 months. I think he did yeoman's work. I think in the end, his own inherent weakness or, compromised position or whatever it is, I think finally got the best of him, and he finally succumbed. But he did hold it off for as long as he could. But notice that the closer we got to congressional recess around the presidential election, where everybody in Congress has to go back and start campaigning for re-election, the more the pressure ramped up. Like they had to do something. The Russians were breaking through all the Ukrainian defenses in the Donbass. Like it was getting bad. Everything was collapsing. And so they had to do something. And so they called in every marker they could. Every friggin' marker. And yet, still, what did the Fed do? What's the big thing the Fed did? Oh, they cut back on QT, shrinking their balance sheet by $5 billion a month more than the market had priced in. Has he cut rates yet? Is he going to cut rates now between now and the election? No, he's not trying to get Biden reelected. Trump is completely, off his rocker on this. But Trump likes low interest rates because he's a mercantilist. Right? So, protection tariffs, weak currency, that, low interest rates, that's Trump's model for the future. It's dumb. When the reality is we need a strong currency, a strong banking system, encouraging savings, and allow the pool of real savings to expand so that we can reindustrialize and onshore all these foreign dollars back into an economy that is better capable of handling it, and go for fiscal rationality on Capitol Hill, which of course all the globalists are fighting tooth and nail. What a shock. So now I think Powell's going to try and hold off until the election. I think he's going to try and hold off until after the September meeting after Jackson Hole. I think that's what he's going to do. And then if we get 1 or 2 rate cuts, and by the way, 1 or 2 rate cuts is not a pivot, folks. It's just a course correction. We're 2.5 years into this rate hike cycle. Does he get to be called weak because he shrunk the balance sheet by only $1.5 trillion and was able to keep interest rates at 5.5% for 2 years? Does that makes him a weak Fed chair? I don't know. But if inflation keeps coming back, he ain't gonna cut rates at all. And then we're talking about rate hikes. And we just stay at 5.5%, and then we go. And the analogy here is the 1970s, and I'll relinquish the mic in just a second. Everybody's trying to turn him into Arthur Burns. I've been saying for a while, I think he's a mixture of Burns and Volcker. He's not going to make Volcker's mistake of raising interest rate, of continuing along with Burns' plan of raising interest rates and then cutting sharply and then having to go to 20%, which is what Volcker did. And Volcker admitted that that was a mistake. What he's going to do is he's going to, Burns raised rates, then held them steady, and then Volcker came in and raised rates and then had to cut and then raise. And everybody only remembers Volcker raising rates to 20%, but everybody forgets that he cut rates to 8% before he went to 20. I think what Powell's plan is to hold rates as high as possible for as long as possible, get rid of the Fed put under the markets, allow foreign capital to figure out where they want to be invested, and whether or not they want to be invested in U.S. dollars or they want to get rid of them. And if so, then that money has to come home, and it has to find a willing and good investment environment, i.e., 5.5% on 3-month money. That's a pretty good investment environment in U.S. dollars. Pretty good. And then hold it there for as long as possible. And then when the second round of commodity cost push inflation comes back, he starts raising rates again. So he doesn't have to cut before he goes higher. That's his goal is. But if he has to cut 1 or 2 times, maybe as many as 3 before he has to go higher, fine. But I don't see Powell cutting to 2% and then going to 9%. I think what we're more likely to see is Powell go from 5.5% back to 4.75, with the intent of having that mean we wind up at 7% and not having to go to 9 or 10% later on. That's what I think his plan is. And I think that that's a far better plan than what we in the gold and hard money community want to believe, because we want the Fed to fail. But you really don't want the Fed to fail, folks. You want all the other crappy central banks to fail, and you want the Fed to fail last. Yeah. Because that's the least disruptive to the global economy, to human suffering, to the possibility of war and conflict and all the other things that are downstream of this. And I'm sorry if you have to, have your big mixed emotions moment, which I define as your mother-in-law driving over the cliff in your brand new Lamborghini. But it's all a big shit sandwich. We all have to take a bite, and we all have to figure out how to get through this. So I keep invoking Stanley Kubrick here because I can't help myself. So.
Yeah, I hear you. It's quite a bit happening at the same time. I'm curious if we have that environment where we do see further interest rate hikes. What do you see as an inevitability in the next 5 to 10 years? What has changed by then? I think a lot about the growing debt loads and seeing the interest expense grow, and seems like at some point, are we headed towards a debt restructure, some sort of default? What is it that has to eventually happen under that scenario?
So I've already pissed off. I've probably already gotten every gold bug's last nerve or silver bug's last nerve with all of this so far. Here's the good news, right? If you're still listening, the good news is that it's going to be a negotiated settlement, folks. It's all about the balance sheets. Okay. Gold has to be remonetized at some point. Judy Shelton came out the other day and somebody said, hey, tweeted at Judy Shelton and said, hey, we demonetized gold in 1971. Isn't it about time we remonetized it? And she's like, not for 2024, more like 2026, period. That's all she said. So let's use Shelton as a very important voice in all of this.
And actually, Tom, one second before you do that, did you happen to see that the Philadelphia Fed actually published a study in January on the effects of stability on long-term prices under a gold standard?
No, I didn't see that, but that's hilarious.
I'll send that over to you. And
yeah, please do, man.
They came to the conclusion that it does stabilize prices over the long term.
Of course it does. Of course it does. So it's now, isn't it nice that we have that now? So now we can use that we can point to that to change the culture inside the Federal Reserve, blah, 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 blah. Right. Okay. So I think that what I see happening is the following. We have central banks levered up relative to their tangible assets, i.e., in this case, their gold reserves, to levels that we've never seen before, to Lehman Brothers levels of leverage, right? We have the ECB with 85% of its balance sheet subject to an interest rate shock, and they have no reserve currency status to fall back on. They have no ability to even print their own currency. The member central banks print the freaking euros. The ECB doesn't print euros. Okay. And they need a higher gold price. They want the Basel III rules to disadvantage American banks versus European banks in order to keep capital frozen in Europe and with the money staying within the European banking system as opposed to moving to the American banking system. This is what Basel III is all about. So Jamie Dimon's not wrong about complaining about Basel III. Did you read his end of the year note to shareholders? I read the whole freaking thing, all 65 pages of it. Okay. And he was very spot on and very clear about how this was designed as a disadvantageous position for American banks. But at the same time, there are provisions within Basel III to ensure that gold isn't rehypothecated to a point where it's used as a suppression tool, right? So that's also part of what's got to go away under Basel III. And Dimon didn't complain about that part of Basel III. He complained about the reserve requirements for U.S. banks as opposed to everybody else, with the Europeans basically saying, well, you're more efficient than us, so we need to kill your banking system so that we can all have a level playing field. Like, shut up, you egalitarian Eurotrash commie bastards. Fuck off. Like, that's serious. Like, I'm done. Like, I'm not listening to this crap anymore. Like, that's exactly what Basel III is saying. Okay, just like to put it in bald face terms. So you wanted Tom. There's Tom. That's what I really think about this. So what we have to have is a restatement of the ratio of the reserve ratio of gold and tangible asset reserves of the central banks relative to the size of the balance sheet. Martin Armstrong's, this is where I absolutely agree with Martin's analysis. For years, I've been trying to tell the gold bugs, we're not going to $80,000 gold. That's crazy. If we do, that means that all the central banks collapsed. That means that all the currencies collapsed and the governments all collapsed. And it's Mad Max, and you better have your ham radio and tins of sardines, and your ability to project lead at a high velocity towards anybody walking onto your property is going to be more important than your gold stack. Just that simple. And he's not wrong. So let's now talk about the scenario that we'd all prefer to live through, which is that what we're seeing with the Fed is actually the model we want to see. The Fed is shrinking its balance sheet while tacitly allowing the gold price to rise in a controlled manner that doesn't do too much damage to everybody's confidence, that keeps everything kind of, moving in the right, trying to unwind slowly all of this, Misesian-esque malinvestment. But it's going to happen over time as the Eurodollar system is drained, as the United States goes back to, as the empire pulls back and all of this stuff. And what the confusing part for so many people is to watch the political leadership of the United States act against this. So I'm like, yeah, that's because they're traitors. That they're not imperialists, folks. They're just traitors for different imperialists. Pick your poison as to who you think those imperialists are: the Chinese, the Zionists, the old colonial powers of Europe. I don't care. Pick one. Just work with that framework, and you're 90% correct. I don't care who the imperialists are. I just know that that's who they are. I just know that they're happening. I have my opinion on it. You have your opinion on it. Hey, let's fight about it on Twitter, but not call each other nasty names. How about we do that? But we're agreed on the basic framework. Once you understand that, you realize that that the balance sheets are going to be delevered to the point where we, as a society, as a global society in effect, and really within each country, we're going to decide, well, our faith in our government is capable of handling a 2x leverage of the balance sheet relative to the gold reserves. And other people are going to be like, nope, 1-to-1. And other people are going to be like, nope, 5-to-1. And that's where it's going to end. And I don't know where that number is, because I don't know where people's heads are, which is part of the reason why I also try to do some kind of, cheap psychological analysis and cultural analysis as to what's happening, to try and get a sense of where I think that negotiated settlement is going to be. So conservatively, or not even conservatively, my basic case, which, I'm willing to, and I'm going to be willing to change, right? I reserve the right to change at a moment's notice, is that it's going to be somewhere between $7,000 and $10,000 gold and about a 3-to-1, and a 3-to-1 leverage on the U.S. balance sheet. Meaning we got to shrink the balance sheet another $1 trillion or so, or $2 trillion, and we got to let the gold price rise from I don't know, whatever I think the gold reserves are worth $800 billion or 600, $700 billion. They got to go to 2.5 trillion. We get the balance sheet down to six, and we got to get the gold reserves up to two. And I think if you have something like that, I think that's a good move. I think the United States, if we don't enter into political clown world where external forces try to break us up as a country and invalidate our bond market, I think that's a very reasonable eventual outcome. And if not, then we're headed towards breakup, civil war, a refutation of the American bond market, defaulting. Everybody starts defaulting on their debt, and the United States breaks up. And wherever you see the hard collateral assets of oil reserves, gas reserves, gold and silver reserves, uranium reserves, potash, blah, blah, all fertilizer reserves, those are the states that are going to have all the assets, and all the other ones are going to be allowed to leave. And that means I wouldn't be long municipal bond debt in New York, for example, or San Diego, or San Francisco, or Philadelphia, or Boston, or Seattle. But I probably, if I needed, some decent, muni bond debt to balance out my portfolio, I might buy Miami or Tampa or Dallas. I won't put Atlanta in that mix because Georgia's political scene is an absolute quagmire. Okay. So if Boise, Idaho, for example, is issuing municipal debt, I'm thinking, yeah, I just saw a report about a massive, truly massive oil report of reserves underneath that area of the country, underneath Idaho, Utah, parts of Montana, that whole area, like enough to double the reserves of the entire world. So the peak oil guys, you're all full of shit. We're about to double the recoverable supply of oil in the world. Okay. And
Well,
that's why Europe, and that's why Europe, and that's why, and that's, and Chris, that's why Europe wants us to get off oil because they don't have it.
yeah, and it's interesting. Obviously, we're seeing it globally, but also, like you point out, that we're seeing some of the divergences between states. You and I are both here in Florida, and I'm sure you see the New Yorkers. I don't know if they come as far up north as you, but certainly you see the flow of people, and perhaps
Yeah.
more so than any other time that I remember, where we're seeing some of these policies really shift. And also do find it interesting how a growing number of states are are enacting legislation about gold and silver, often citing the same reasons as we hear out of the BRICS. So certainly a daunting time
People are
ahead.
getting,
So
they're getting ready. Interestingly enough, this on your point about what I see up here in North Florida, which I still think is in a bull market. I think South Florida is now overvalued, and I think the money's going to rotate out of South Florida into North Florida as much as it's still rotating out of New York and California and Washington and other places around the country. I can tell you, there's that line from the movie Civil War. I haven't seen it yet, but I saw the trailer where it's like, well, we're all Americans here. Well, what kind of Americans are you? Well, I got news for you. Every Californian that buys a 5-acre parcel of land up here with a double wide on it, or with a small brick house, an old cracker house on it, and it's going to breathe. They have the neighbors come down the road, metaphorically speaking, with the cup of sugar in their hand and some brownies and the whole 9 yards to welcome them to the neighborhood. Say, you're from California. You're not one of them kind of Californians, are you? Okay. Like, it's real, folks. It's real. It's here. And they won't be, and they're not going to come to North Florida and turn it into, Austin, Texas. They already did that with Gainesville. And even Gainesville's not going to be Gainesville real soon now, because the University of Florida, I was talking to my wife yesterday about this. We were talking about the protests on the Ivy League campuses and what I think about that. And I wrote a big post for you guys don't know this. I wrote a big post for the patrons on Sunday, which is going to get reworked, and I'll put it out in public, about what I think is going on with the protests and how that ties into the Civil Rights Act and Title VI and all this other stuff. But one of the interesting things about it is that we're already seeing big endowments to the Ivy League schools go away. right? We see Bill Ackman pulled his money. I saw something else this morning that that like MIT isn't using diversity as an admission requirement anymore. There was another one I saw this morning as well, and the Ivy League is being the Ivy League, right? And my wife turned to me and said, "Oh, by the way, the University of Florida is now placing more people in, you know, major positions around the country than the Ivy League schools are." It's a big deal. This is why DeSantis de-wokeifying the entire educational system and legal system in the state of Florida at the state level is so significant. So he's clearly setting Florida up as a bastion of, or the beginnings of the new, power centers in North America, whatever that winds up being, be it that they lead the Sunshine Republic of Florida out of the old United States, or we just take over the United States and box up DC and New York and LA and turn them into John Carpenter movies and be done with them and turn them into museums, which is what's happening to them, by the way. I don't know. We'll see. But the power shift is happening. The demographic shift has been happening, and it's clear as day. You're closer to it than I am, where you settled. I'm not gonna tell you where Chris settled, but I know where he is, and I know that that's like the epicenter of all of this, that whole corridor. And by the way, it's also happening on both coasts of Florida. It's not just happening on either the East Coast or the West Coast, happening everywhere. South of the Ocala National Forest, it's just massive. And those of you who haven't been in Florida, haven't lived in Florida like I have for 37 years, you don't understand the change. You just don't understand the change. So,
well, it's somewhat reflective of what you mentioned in your column that I pulled up earlier about how capital goes where it's treated the best. We're seeing that happen globally. We're seeing it happen on the states. And Tom, I really appreciate everything you laid out here. And perhaps just wrapping up, you can let folks know. I'll pull up the website in the background and just let them know a bit about what you do there and how they can sign up or just read some of the things there, because I think it's certainly an important time and you're providing a lot of great information. And if you could just touch on that.
sure, I can. And part of my biggest regret at this point is that I don't have as much time to write publicly as I would like. I have so many requirements now for my paid subscribers, both the Gold Goats and Guns and Newsmax, that it's actually really putting a damper on how much I can actually put out publicly. So I do my best. I actually try to use media like this, and I appreciate you let me on this morning, Chris, to have this conversation, to try and work through a lot of these ideas. But we do it on the blog, we do it in the podcast when I can remember to book a guest, and frankly, and we do it within the confines of the Patreon service, which for anywhere either from $4 or $12 a month for you to just sit and get a download of what's happening, what I think is happening in the world. I don't know if it's worth it to you. Great. There's Quinny. She's telling you to become a patron, and just ping on that and do the thing, and pick your poison. And it's not I think it's worth it. I have enough people telling me that you don't charge nearly enough money, and I don't know. I think that's usually a good sign. When people are telling you you're not charging enough money, you probably got a price right. So we'll go from there.
Well, that was what was popping into my head as well. And again, I think the important part is that you're sharing a lot of information that is important at this time, not easy to dig through. So you can find that at tomluongo.me. I will also have the link in the description field below. And Tom, with that said, we'll wrap up this call. But pleasure to see you as always, and just appreciate that we have folks out there like you that are able to make sense out of a lot of these things that are going on. And you take good care of yourself, and we'll be in touch, and we'll have to do this again soon.
Absolutely, Chris. Anytime you want. And as we talked about before we got on the air, I'm going to hold you to it publicly. So one of these days you need to come on up to the greatness that is Redneckville and in the northern part of the state. Now that you're part of the Florida community, and see what it looks like up here, and get away from where you are down there, and just we'll have a great time up here. You're more than welcome to my home whenever you want. We'll do the thing.
Sure appreciate that, and we'll be looking forward to that. And yeah, it'd be fun to play some music too, as
Oh, that would
Tom
be
is quite an avid.
an absolute blast. My drum room is nearly finished. I'm like, and drum room slash man cave nearly finished. So we'll get the place cleaned up and we'll do the thing. All right, man. Talk soon.